Purnell Sweat High School. My name is Tom Randolph, and I am a park ranger up at Mount Jefferson State Natural Area, where I'm filming from today. Well, November is Native American Heritage Month, and I think every month should be Native American Heritage Month. But today I'm going to share with you a little bit about where I'm at and where I work and where I live. And this place is very important to me. I love being outside. I love being out under the trees and listening to the water flowing. And I'm sure that where you're at, you have places, quiet places to go along the Lumbee River, places where you can kayak or where you can fish or where you can swim. And all of these places are so important, and it's so important to find these special places. And also, when we find them, I think we all want to protect them too, so they're just well taken care of. So today we're going to learn a little bit about some of the scientific methods that are used for good stewardship and protecting these beautiful places, especially the water today. Now first I want to share with you a little bit more about what I like to do when I'm outside. When I'm not working as a park ranger, when I'm off duty, I like to go out and I like to paint pictures. I'll go out in the woods for hours. Sometimes I'll stay out overnight, and I'll just sit out in the woods and get pastels and different paints and go out, and I like to paint. And I also like to fish, and I just also like to hike and explore and hear what I can hear and see what I can see. So there are many people that have written about the Lumbee River. And one person who is a hydrologist, and his name is Dr. Emanuel, and Dr. Ryan Emanuel, who is a Lumbee tribal member, writes this. He says, "As a Lumbee person, I descend from indigenous peoples who have paddled, canoed on these exact streams since time immemorial. I have a lifelong love of paddle sports that evolved through various stages of my life. I'm currently into canoeing, paddling, paddleboarding, black streams in eastern North Carolina, sometimes alone and sometimes with family or friends." So Dr. Emanuel, he is a hydrologist, so he studies water. He studies how water impacts humans and also how humans impact water using a variety of quantitative methods and qualitative methods, using scientific methods. He also writes, "I think indigenous ways of knowing are important to share because they help us see a bigger picture of water and life." Right behind me, you might notice, there's a rather large rock. And around this entire area is a rock called amphibolite. Now near the Lumbee River, I'm assuming y'all probably have a lot of sedimentary rock. And I would challenge you to find out maybe more about the types of rock that are around your community. I'd also challenge you to ask your parents and your grandparents and some of the senior people in your community what they know and what they think about the rocks in your area. So one of the ways that we look at rock, we look at the things growing on it, like these lichens. And lichens are basically the green stuff here. This is a photosynthetic algae. It takes the sun, 93 million miles away, that star that this planet is orbiting. The light shines on it, turns that light into sugar and starch and into oxygen that we breathe. Down beneath the rock, we see all this brown material, and this is soil. And one of the ways, I like to use color to paint, but also in soil science, which is something you might get interested in, we use color as well. This book is called a Munsell Soil Color Chart. And what you do is you take a sample of soil and you hold it up and you try to compare it to the colors that are here. And what I'm seeing right now is this color right here matches the soil in my hand. So I go down here and I see the number here is 2 and the number here is 0. So this is a 7YR2/0. And that's a way you get to know about the soil color, how you identify it. Instead of saying, well, it looks like, so-and-so's, somebody's barn or something like that. Everybody doesn't know what somebody's barn looks like. So there's a book that actually has all these colors labeled so you can identify the soils by color. Another method that's used with the rocks has to do with the rock hardness. And there's a thing called the Mohs hardness scale, and that basically is a scale. Talc, a very, very soft rock, and 10 would be hardest rock on the earth, which would be what? Very expensive rock, diamond. So the diamond is a 10, talc is a 1 basically. And this amphibolite here, this rock is about a 5, so it's about halfway. Another challenge I would give you would be to check out the rocks around your community and see what the rock hardness types are. And also see if those rocks are maybe susceptible to any type of acids dissolving them. Up here in the mountains, the main way these rocks are broken down into soil is through a process called frost wedging. The water will fall on the rocks, and if that water freezes when it gets really cold, the water expands, quite a bit of its volume, it expands out, and when it expands, it literally cracks the rock. Just like if you were to leave a soda can in your freezer overnight, it would probably bust the can. That same process has been breaking this rock down. Now, if you're in a community that has limestone, most likely that rock is going to be broken down through chemical weathering. And chemical weathering would be like, if you breathe into your hand, you breathe out, that gas you're breathing out is carbon dioxide or CO2. And if you mix that CO2 with water, and water's formula is H2O, CO2 plus H2O makes H2CO3. And that's carbonic acid, and that's as much chemistry as we're doing today. Put simply, what I would do if I wanted to make carbonic acid, I'd get a straw in a cup and then just blow bubbles. If I'm blowing bubbles into a cup, my CO2 is mixing with that water, that H2O, and I'd make a weak acid. Now that weak acid is what breaks down limestone through what's called chemical weathering. So physical weathering with the ice in the rock and chemical weathering are the main ways the rock gets broken down into this wonderful stuff we call soil. And then the soil gets eroded through wind or water. It just eroded away. This rock's not going to erode because it hasn't been weathered. All right. Well, before we go to our next area to go out to the water, I thought I might also share another quote with you. And this quote is from Land Education, and it says, colonial perspectives often see land as a commodity, as something to control and exploit for the colonizer's benefit. Dolores Calderon says, all places were once indigenous land, and they continue to be indigenous land. Changes do not sever the relationship that indigenous groups have with the land. And just like Dr. Emmanuel, he's out canoeing and kayaking, and he's also using some of the scientific methods to better protect these resources, or these beautiful places, as I call them when I'm not working as a ranger. So let's go down to the water and see how we might protect the water here, and also how you might become maybe a better steward of the water on the Lumbee River, so you can maybe protect it. Okay, let's go take a look. I find it to be pretty easy to realize how wonderful life is when I'm outside. When I come out into these sacred places, like at the Lumbee River or out here in these woods, I realize that there's so much that I'm just not aware of, and there's so much that I have to learn. And one of the ways I learn is by being outside. I also read and learn that way, and I'd like to read something from Dr. Emmanuel again. And if you remember, he's a Lumbee tribal member, and he's a hydrologist. And Dr. Emmanuel writes, from a Lumbee perspective, the river most certainly provides benefits, but the relationship is a two-way relationship. Lumbee people respect and honor the river, and they spend time in and around its waters for work, recreation, and worship. In doing so, the people and the river have each infused the other with identity to the extent both share the same name. Dr. Quang Lee writes, often said Mother Nature has a culture, and its culture is native culture. some of these places are parks. Some of these beautiful places outside are protected. And currently, the Secretary of the Interior is a tribal person. Her name is Deb Helland. She writes, "We must shift our thinking away from short-term gain toward long-term investment and sustainability, and always have the next generation in mind with every decision we make." Remember, she is the Secretary of the Interior in charge of the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, pretty much the vast majority of the public lands in the United States. Everything depends on our ability to sustainably inhabit the earth, she writes. And true sustainability will require us to change our way of thinking on how we take from the earth and how we give back. Let's go down to the bigger water and see what's going on down there. Behind me in this pond, you'll notice that the water looks rather dark, and it's supposed to be dark. That darker color of water is the tannins, natural tannins in the water, just like at the Lumbee River. The river is supposed to be like that. That's the color that it's supposed to be because of the plants that are there, because of the cypress trees and the other vegetation. And park rangers know this through science. But as Dr. Brayboy, who is also a Lumbee tribal member, he writes that the Lumbee people and indigenous people have been using science for thousands of years prior to the scientific method that's used today in the West. He writes, "We notice when animal migration patterns changed, or plants that were useful as food or medicine. This is what native science looked like, and this is what it continues to look like." He says the power lies in a connection to place. Indigenous methodologies happen in context, in a moment, and in a place. So here in this place, we're going to apply some Western science, and this is called a seki dish. And what you do is you lower it down into the water. There are little marks on this string, and this will tell us how far down we can see this dish. So we're using just direct observations, just as have been used for thousands of years by indigenous people. We're just kind of adding a word to it, calling it a seki dish. So we'll try this out in just a second. So here I am. I'm going to lower this down in the water. And I can still see it. Now it's kind of disappeared. So what I would do is measure this, see, well, where is it at? And then take a reading and say, okay, I can see it down this far, which is, say, maybe about a foot. So this is how you might use a seki dish to determine the turbidity or the clarity of the water. All right, so how do we get to know about our water quality? One of the big things that you might want to test for are nitrates. And nitrates can be, well, nitrates can show you that there might be some kind of pollution in your water. It might be coming from septic tanks. It might be some sort of a discharge from some kind of a pipe somewhere. And by taking a sample of water in something like this and then doing the test, we could find out if there are nitrates in the water. Nitrates act as a fertilizer, basically. Another thing we might want to look for would be phosphates. And we can also test by taking a sample of water and, again, testing for phosphates in the water, which can come from laundry soap and other things that get into the water that aren't filtered out in some of our septic or some of our water treatment plants. Some of them, they don't actually filter out phosphates. We could use a large kind of a kit that looks at a variety of things, from everything from nitrates and phosphates to even lead and copper and iron. And by what you do is you lower the strip into the water and you take it out for a minute, and then you compare it to the colors on the back here to get an idea of what the water quality is. And then probably the most simplest would be to take a sample of water and just test for the pH. See what is the pH level of the water. And we can do all of these things in our streams and at the Lumbee River and find out what the water quality is. But another method we could use is called macroinvertebrates. And the macroinvertebrates are the little creatures that live in the water here. Some of them are tolerant to pollution. So if they're in polluted water, they're like, I don't care, I don't mind. But then there are others like the caddisfly or the dragonfly nymph or the damselfly. All of these little creatures, they can't tolerate pollution. So if you don't find them in the water, then that indicates there may be some kind of pollution in the water that's keeping that population down. Now, this might be a surprise to some of you, or some of you may have observed it, but a dragonfly and a caddisfly, the dragonfly that you see flying around, when they start off, when they come out of their eggs, they actually start off as these little kind of almost wormy looking creatures. Some of them have legs and some of them don't. And they live under the water. They stay under the water until the right time, and then they crawl out. They put their wings out that dry, and then the rest of their life they spend flying around in the sky. They never go back to living under the water. So those little, when they're under the water, we call them macroinvertebrates. And I'm going to get a net, and we're going to see if there are any macroinvertebrates in this water right now. And we can do the same thing at the Lumbee River when I come over and visit. Let's see what happens. All right, I have my net. I have my waders on. And let's go out here and see what we can see. Clear off a little area. And then I'm going to scoop. And as you can see, I've got a bunch of muck here, and I'm going to sort through it and see what I can find, but I don't want to take up the whole video doing that, so we'll check with me in a minute. Okay, so we are doing our nitrate test, and I've already put the first test tablet into the vial with the 5 milliliters of water, and now I'm going to put the second tablet into the test tube to see. Here it is, and we're going to test for nitrate levels here in this lake, in this pond. I put the lid on it, and I have to shake it up and leave it in here for 5 minutes and see what happens after 5 minutes. So I'll be back in 5 minutes. All right, it's been 5 minutes. Let's see what our sample looks like. And when I hold it up, it looks to me to be the closest would be maybe around the 5, somewhere between 0 and 5 parts per million, which is pretty good. It's actually really good for nitrate levels. So that's a good thing to see. Now another test we can do real quick is pH, which is potency of hydrogen or acids. Remember, every number below 7 is an acid, every number above 7 is a base. So I have a sample here, and we're going to put some indicator in it and see what the pH is of this water might be. And we'll put a few drops in it and shake it. And now we take these colors in this box here and match the color up with this. And ooh, it does looks like it is a little bit acidic. It looks like it's about maybe a 5.5. So this water is mildly acidic, but remember we started off saying there are natural tannic acids in this water. That's why the water is so dark. So I am not really that surprised that it is mildly acidic because of the natural tannins that are in the water. Just like in the Lumbee River, I bet you the water is mildly acidic there, again, because of the natural tannins that are in the water. And all of these are really methods of using different types of science to try and be better stewards of our natural resources, of these resources. As a park ranger, I say that. More from the indigenous ways of knowing perspective, I'd like to read a little bit from several different authors, and they write each location is based on tribal history, ancient knowledge, and experience. This means there is no one indigenous religion that explains the belief or creed of every tribe. Tribal people continue to practice traditional spiritual ceremonial practices to relate to environmental stewardship. Some tribal religions share certain universal values regarding sustainability. For example, many tribal values see protection for future generations and community over immediate short-term goals. And that kind of reminds me what our Secretary of Interior said. And there's what's known as the 7-generation perspective. That basically is the idea that whatever you do now should hopefully not have an impact on the next generation, the next generation, the next generation, all the way up to the 7th generation. And that's another perspective. So let's look a little bit more closely at this mountain in this area before we wrap things up for the day. So as we come to the end of the day here on Mount Jefferson, I wanted to include a little bit of a poem from the Poet Laureate. And this is the U.S. Poet Laureate, and she is also an indigenous writer. She's a tribal writer. She's Muskogee Creek. And she writes, "Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away tonight." And that was written by Joy Harjo, Poet Laureate of the United States. Well, thank you again so much for spending some time with me this afternoon. And I'd like to leave with a few words from several different writers about indigenous ways of knowing as we think more about Native American Heritage Month. Dr. Kortweg explains, land extends beyond material fixed space. Land is a spiritually infused place, grounded in interconnected and interdependent relationships. Megan Bang writes, learning about the natural world is critically necessary given the social, scientific realities such as climate change. And finally, land education requires us to consider indigenous agency and resistance. These are tied to indigenous cosmologies and ways of knowing.